In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte made a blunder. Or did he? We have a habit within the historiography of the Peninsular War of characterizing it as the beginning of something, not necessarily the beginning of the end or even the beginning of the middle of the end, but certainly a backward step, a point at which Napoleon screwed things up, created an unnecessary war, opened up a second front, perhaps even created a soft underbelly to his European empire. But how accurate is that interpretation? Is it fair to say that Napoleon screwed up? And did people really give a monkeys about what was happening over in Portugal and Spain? Tonight, as part of the suite of Christmas episodes, we return to the Peninsular War saga to zoom out rather than focus on the nitty-gritty of events in Spain. We talk about the wider European reaction to Napoleon's actions in the Iberian Peninsula, the impact of events like the Battle of Bailén, and ask the important question: was the Peninsular War just an irrelevant sideshow? This is the Peninsular War, the global perspective. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. And not for the first time, Merry Christmas, folks. Although, of course, if you're listening to this after the Christmas break, then Happy New Year, I suppose, is much more appropriate. We are returning for another Peninsular War installment. But as part of this series, we always said that we wanted to include the Spanish perspective and the Portuguese, but we also wanted to take that much bigger, more global perspective. I might have been slightly influenced by reading the work of a certain Alex Mikaberidze in taking that stance. And how better to do that than to reprise the dynamic duo that excited folks this time last year. We had an episode that was entitled Napoleon the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and two of both my and your favourite scholars appeared on the show to debate all the different aspects. It produced some peerless moments. In fact, there are two moments from that which have gone down in the State of the Union episode as best moments of the last year on this show. But the Queen, the Empress, the Stadtholder S of greatest moment on this podcast has, of course, got to be Beatrice de Graaf for that inimitable comment that Napoleon was a misogynistic prick. Bitch sort of smiles
Still stand
knowingly,
by that comment. Yeah.
but that's what I love about it. We need to have a conversation about whether or not that's going on a mug because I'm adamant that it needs to. Beatrice, welcome back, folks. I'm sure you know by now, but Beatrice is professor of diplomatic history and security studies at the University of Utrecht, author of Fighting Terror After Napoleon, fresh from a TV appearance, no less. So thank you for taking the time in a very hectic schedule in the run up to Christmas to devote time to Napoleonic nerdery. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. And very nice to be here with you and Alex, who is in even more, or I would say in a unique situation now somewhere else in Georgia.
Indeed, we are. We are joined once again by Alex Mikaberidze. I could do a very long and effusive and praiseworthy introduction for Alex, but he's frankly sick of them. He shakes his head emphatically. He hasn't shaken his fist at me, which is a good sign. But I think that's probably just because Alex is really nice, and so he wouldn't shake his fist at anybody. Alex is taking the time to join us from Georgia, no less, where things are.
Georgia, Europe, that is, not the United
Yes,
States.
thank
Yes,
you. Yeah,
yes.
good point. Georgia, Europe, rather than the US state, where things are um, sounding even worse than I picked up from the news. Quite frankly, during the day job, of course, Alex is professor of history at Louisiana State University, Shreveport, and is the Ruth Herring Knoll in the the Ruth Herring Knoll Endowed Chair for the James Smith Knoll Collection. One of these days,
Thank
I'll
you.
get
Thank you.
through that.
Yeah, I know.
without
I
screwing
thought
it
by
up?
now you would know how to say it, yeah, but
Well,
you're
well,
still stumbling. It's mouthful.
it is. I mean, it's an impressive title. The Beau would be jealous because he loves one of these sort of grandiose and effusive titles. How are you, Alex? How are things?
Good, good. Yeah, I'm here in Georgia on the Fulbright working on a big project. So this is my second visit this year. So exciting times, very interesting times politically. Georgia's at the crossroads, but it's also time when I think as a historian you can, in many ways, witness firsthand some of the political and administrative and even police changes that we actually describe in our own books, right? When we talk about kind of the emergence of Napoleonic police state and some of the changes that Napoleon introduced for control mechanism, and then you see how current Georgian government is flexing its muscle in terms of to control the demonstrations. The actually the similarities are there. So, uh, in short, it's an interesting time to be here.
I can well imagine. We quite often sort of look back at the past and sort of think, how did somebody allow this to happen? Surely something like that wouldn't happen these days. And then increasingly, you look at the direction of politics in varying nations and sort of start to think, hmm, perhaps history is much more cyclical than we like to acknowledge.
Yes, and I think it underscores the importance of history. I hosted, well, I'm actually will host in January a panel, but I attended the first of this series of panels on role of historical memory and history, and we focused on the events of 1920s, which are the rise of Soviet Union, but also important developments in the Caucasus. And the panel was packed. I mean, standing room only. People, young people, especially, were all interested in hearing what we have to say. So, unlike I think parts of the United States or maybe even Europe, where budget cuts are all targeting history departments and humanities, there's a still a strong appreciation of it here in Georgia.
It feels a bit odd to sort of pivot away from that and to Napoleonic history. Um, but I suppose we should because that is sort of the point of the show. But um, I do want to take the opportunity to encourage folks to make sure that they are reading up on events in Georgia as well as elsewhere in Europe, and think carefully about the implications that this has for all of us going forwards, because what can happen in one country can happen in any country. And we often talk about things like security by bringing Beatrice on and sort of talking about various facets of that. And we do have a laugh and a joke on this show because that's part of the beauty that we can when there are 200 years between us and the events that we talk about. But when history starts to sort of ring very true and sound very similar to what we uh, hear on the news today, suddenly things become decidedly less amusing and require much more careful thought about the roles that all of us have to play in terms of shaping the futures that we will see and that our children will see.
Well said.
Yes.
There isn't a nice segue for this. So apologies, folks. I am just going to have to dive straight in. I can't form a bridge. I can't form a connection. It's just about getting straight into the Napoleonic element. I set it up perhaps for a failure in the introduction by talking about, Napoleon makes a blunder, Napoleon screws things up, etc., etc. Um, and there's an interesting question about whether or not that is actually the case, or at least whether or not the perception is there. Whether there's the belief in 1807, particularly when we have the situation with Portugal, but also in 1808, whether Napoleon really has made a mistake, whether he has overstretched, or whether this is just a continuation of him doing fundamentally what he wants, and this is the new reality of politics. particularly post Treaty of Tilsit. So, what is the initial reaction, would you say, to Napoleon's actions? Let's say specifically with Portugal, first of all. Um, and to what extent do the varying nations of Europe sort of look at what happens in Portugal and kind of go, yeah, this is how it is now? Or is there genuine concern of a potential snowball effect in terms of, well, if Napoleon can do it with Portugal, what's to say he can't do it with other nations in Europe?
Can I make a little bridge though between what we just discussed and this? Because in my mind there is, and I would also like to ask Alex about this. So, what I do think, if we witness events of today going on in the Middle East and in Europe and in Eastern Europe, some of those events really hark back to this era in the 19th century, where the international relations, also something that we talk about, the strategy, the global situation changed completely. So Napoleon upended everything. And what he did and what he inflicted on Europe is that there were a completely new alignment of powers arose. And he was the first one to throw the stone in the water of the 18th century, the cabinet wars, the petty little monarchs. So what he did is he sort of forced the other powers of Europe to pronounce themselves. Are they big powers? Are they able to mobilize and recruit men and power and firepower and willingness and a support base in society to stand up against him or not? So what you see is that we all know this, but just to make the point, before the 1800s, there were so many little fiefdoms, little chiefdoms, little ducalities, little princedoms in Europe. And then after that, actually a kind of a triumvirate of Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain arose. And France joined them a couple of years later. And France already had been a great power, but now it sort of suffocated all the other powers. And it was a big battle, but you could say it lasted for 1 century, of who would be able to draw the pettier monarchies, the pettier states into his orbit, into his sphere of influence. So the whole notion of the sphere of influence, the balance of power, this really was born. We know all about it, but we saw it happened in the early 1800s, and it's happening now again. That almost a kind like 19th century power play, trying to draw a state like Georgia in the band of your sphere of influence. Russia's doing that. In the Middle East, you see that too, in a different realignment of powers, where Syria is now the object of either Turkey, Russia, Iran. So the big powers, they try to suffocate and try to embrace the smaller powers in the sphere of influence. And we haven't seen politics like this for a very long time, because since the middle of the 20th century, we had, well, you can still argue about it, we had a kind of a rule-based, institutionally based international order. With the Cold War, it was very much aligned into the camps. And then in the 19th century, sorry, in the 90s of the late 20th century, there was this alleged new world order with the United Nations and the right to protect, etc. And now we're sort of back to the 19th century. So we will talk Napoleon in a minute, but what Napoleon tried to do with Portugal, what he did to Spain, was what Russia is now doing with Georgia, try to exert the influence in a country that's you feel is directly in your sphere of influence, and try to pry it away from this other power bulwark. So Portugal and the Netherlands always had been the strongholds of Britain, and the satellite states, the landing places, and the Tagus of Portugal, and the Scheldt for the Netherlands and Belgium always had been kind of the linking pinks for Great Britain on the continent. And now France stood up and said, no, we're going to take it. It's ours. And Portugal and Spain had been big, and were until that point in time, big empires in their own right, but they were being reduced, they were suffocated by those two, by Britain and France. And after 1813-14, they never restored back to their big role as empire. So they were more like power plays in the hand of Napoleon, and then later on in a different situation. So in that sense, I do see the volatility and the dynamics of this first decade of the 19th century sort of mirrors what's going on now in parts of Europe and the Middle East. But that's perhaps thinking it too globally. But what do you think, Alex?
So I agree. I mean, in many respects, we know that there are many leaders nowadays who want to return to the arrangements where the world is perceived as spheres of influence, the backyards of great powers. And certainly Eastern Europe, Caucasus are good examples of it. Vladimir Putin has stated on multiple occasions that the world that or the world that he wants to see, the world of the late 19th century great powers. So whether that is possible in the post-World War II period and with its new rules of international engagement that we've set in place, that's a different case. But the aspiration is certainly there. But to go back to kind of Zach's original question of whether this was a mistake or not, I think it would be too early. So in the other podcasts that I'm involved, we're taking time. Each episode deals with particular moment in time. So if we are, let's say, sometime in late 1807 or early 1808, then I don't think Napoleon's decision to go into Spain will be perceived as a mistake, because until the end of the year, really, I would say until 1809, it seems like he's succeeding. The invasion unfolds of both, in Portugal, there's a minor setback, but it's perceived to be as nothing but a temporary one. The invasion of Spain in 1808 unfolds pretty well. It's the spring of 1808 is a series of French successes. And even if we allow for the uprising, for the Spanish uprising in May in Madrid, we have also to remember that Dos de Mayo was followed by Tres de Mayo and the fierce crackdown, which the French prevailed in. And then if we look at the summer of 1808, we also will see that Napoleon is busy consolidating his authority in Spain, implementing constitution. So it certainly appears like he is prevailing. The quick, the series of uprisings that will spread, and which I hope we'll discuss in late summer of 1808, will only bring fierce Napoleonic invasion, second one, right, in the fall of 1808. And that also succeeds, right? Madrid is taken. The Spanish resistance is brushed aside. So I think if I were a contemporary observer in 1809, I would not be certainly predisposed in thinking that this was a mistake. It certainly doesn't appear it until much later. And of course, much of what has been written is written with the advantage of a hindsight, and knowing that the degree to which the French army will be enmeshed here. I think there's one of the historians who referred to it with a little bit of a historical comparison to Spain being Napoleon's Vietnam. But the point is there. At the height of the conflict, Napoleon has hundreds of thousands of men committed, enormous resources sent to Spain. And yes, by 1814, it becomes clear that it was a mistake. But it certainly, I don't think it's obvious in 1809. If anything, for outside observers, I think it's not necessarily a mistake, but it's a confirmation of what Beatrice was alluding to, and that is Napoleon's inability to abide by existing rules of engagement. Now, Napoleon can argue that, and like Albert Sobol, the great French historian, later argued that, that he has not done anything that other powers have not done. I like to remind the listeners that Napoleon's detention of the Spanish royal family is not a unique event. In fact, in 1802, 1803, the Russians have done the same thing in Georgia, where the Georgian royal house was detained, arrested, and exiled to Russia, which was a key element in the Russian takeover of Georgian kingdom. So, essentially, Napoleon is operating in this environment, but I think the degree to which he's willing to bend, if not openly violate the rule, what we were taking for granted, the rules of engagement, was jarring, certainly for many contemporaries. And it comes, of course, at the end of this long series of Napoleonic annexations. Piedmont. Think about the Batavian Kingdom or Batavian Republic, later Dutch Kingdom. Think about the German annexations. And of course, it will continue through the 1809 with the takeover of the Illyrian and Dalmatian provinces. So the question for the contemporaries would be, at what point does Napoleon stop? I think that's the famous kind of favorite line of argument that Charles Esdale, with whom I debate often enough, likes to take, right? Like Napoleon is a rogue state that is unwilling to stop.
Mhm. Can I throw in a question and also a reflection here? I really like what you said about Spain being the Vietnam of Napoleon, also even given the fact that it wasn't clear from the beginning. But you sort of argue from the point of contextualized historical knowledge at the time, but and then on the basis of how successful Napoleon was on the ground initially. But the thing is, already starting in 1807, 1808, it still to me is not clear, and that again is a kind of a parallel to the Americans in Vietnam. So you could make a case that his whole intention, his whole strategy from the onset on was flawed because on the one hand, he already had France as Spain. He already had concluded treaties with Spain, the Treaty of Ildefonso, the Treaty of Aranjuez. Spain was already an ally. It was, of course, it was a weak ally. It was a corrupt ally, and Napoleon knew that Manuel Godoy, Spain's prime minister, was an intriguer, and he had set out and had put out feelers to Russia. It was all clear, but still, Spain was in the camp of Napoleon. So why then invade it? So that already is a question. And his strategy was also that he thought if he would invade it and be able to reform Spain, make it more centralized, make it more modern, then Spain would yield more dividends to him. But that also is kind of a strange strategy because it totally underestimated and did not reckon with the arch-conservative nature of the Spanish institutions, the clergy, the people, the farmers, the court. So he thought that he could just go in a tabula rasa kind of situation, in a vacuum, and remold whole Spain and make it more effective or productive to his likings. But that's a strange strategy, and he should have known that I mean, he already knew how hard it was to reform France and to work with the material in France. So why then also take into account Portugal and Spain that were even more black boxes to him, and he wasn't even interested. I mean, he had intelligence materials on Spain and Portugal. He knew how reactionary they were, and still he did it on the height of his power. So he was not threatened by Spain. He could have kept Spain on a leash. Spain had already lost its big position internationally speaking. I mean, I can see that the strategy was that after the Treaty of Tilsit with Russia, that Napoleon thought with keeping up, and we talked about this before, Alex, the continental system. He would need Spain and Portugal to keep up the continental system and dry Britain out, but still already had all that in play. So he was siphoning off numerous troops, thousands of troops, to something that wasn't strategically not even necessary at the point. So that is where I think he did make a mistake. Perhaps not a mistake on the ground, but a mistake strategically. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't necessary at the point. So that's for me something that I still cannot entirely wrap my hand around. But perhaps you have the answer.
Well, let me start say from the outset that I agree with you wholeheartedly. But I think the argument that you are making are in many ways arguments from a hindsight. We know of those issues post factum, right? Napoleon knew of some, but I don't think he knew the extent, let's say, of resistance he would face. And it's clear in the correspondence that, sure, his ambassadors, his envoys to Spain warned him about the conservative nature of the Spanish society and the potential for the resistance, but Napoleon always clearly downplayed those. And I don't think in doing this he's any different, because I think we have plenty of examples in modern history where the governments make decisions to go to war without fully understanding the consequences, right? They will be greeted as liberators kind of approach. I think, but you raise an important point, Beatrice, and that is the need to understand why Napoleon goes into Spain, why he goes into Portugal. Partly, I think for me, it is something that you alluded to, and that is Spain is an ally, but is an untrustworthy ally. And that becomes clear in 1806 when Godoy factually mobilizes Spain for a war with an unclear enemy, but Napoleon clearly interpreted this as that being France. So he knew that essentially he was under clear impression that had the war of the Fourth Coalition gone the other way, Spain would have jumped at an opportunity to confront France. So those are the things that I don't think Napoleon, knowing who he was, would have allowed simply to slide. Part of it is economic. And this is where I think I lean a bit more, and that is Napoleon's continental blockade and continental system. So kind of reminding listeners that those are not the same things, but two really important social, economic, political initiatives that Napoleon kind of put forth. Both of them, especially the blockade, dependent on the collaboration of Portugal and Spain. And that's not the collaboration that was forthcoming to the degree that Napoleon needed for the system to succeed. So I think when I look at Napoleon's decision to go into Spain, I think I look at more at the economics and imperial imperatives. A friend of mine, Professor Kenneth Johnson, for example, makes an argument in his forthcoming book on Napoleon and the sea. He makes an argument that Napoleon's invasion of Spain was actually occasioned to a large degree by Napoleon's naval needs. Mm-hmm. And that includes the control of Spanish fleet, the control of these enormous material resources that Spain had, and material that France actually did not. One thing that I do want remind the listeners is that unlike other great powers, Spain in 1808 was the only one whose empire remained intact. France has lost its empire, right? Colonial empire, of course. It has lost colonial empire. Even Britain, the premier imperial state, has lost parts of its imperial domain in the North America. But Spanish Empire is still, on the surface of it, still intact. So Spain has the potential to tap enormous resources, and especially resources like silver. There is a wonderful study on the role of Mexican silver in Napoleonic Wars. And we know the role and importance of that silver, mined in places like Zacatecas in Mexico and elsewhere, was such that in 1805, 1804, 1805, almost into through the 1806, Britain, France, Dutch, and Spanish were willing to set aside their political disagreements and collaborate on a scheme that allowed all of them to partake in the silver output. Now that comes to essentially to an end with the outbreak of the war, the Fourth Coalition, and then the ongoing conflict with and a larger conflict between France and Britain that intensifies after the fall of the Ministry of All Talents. But I think Napoleon understood the degree to which Spain could complement his war effort because it had so many resources that were underutilized. I think Schroeder has a wonderful expression when he talks about Napoleon's decision to, and as of course Paul Schroeder and Beatrice, you know him.
Yes, transformation of European relations. That's what I alluded to, a complete upending of the situation in Europe. Yeah.
And Schroeder has so many wonderful kind of one-liners in his book, and one of them was that looking at Spain's kind of corruption and ineffectiveness that you've mentioned, Schroeder says that it offended Napoleon's professional sensibilities. And I love it in that he clearly saw that Spain was misruled, that it could have been managed so much better. And I think that's one also one we cannot I think dismiss that part of reasoning either.
No, but that was, and that is not in hindsight quite a silly thought. I mean, already at the time, with this whole thick history of Spanish entanglement, intricate relations in the court, conflicts within the country, all the different areas in Spain, Napoleon should have known, and it was spelled out to him, that it was not a country that you could shape and mold as a centralized country as France was in the 18th century. So France already had gone to a series of major reforms and centralization efforts, far more than Spain. And Spain still relied on its big grandeur and its colonial power. But another point that's also very striking to me, and it's not hindsight, it's there already. It's the lost Battle of Trafalgar. And after the Battle of Trafalgar, the fleet in Spain was completely destroyed. And during the years of the Peninsular War, there was no naval fleet to speak of. And the only thing that I could think of, and I haven't looked that up, is that Napoleon, and there was Zach, there was on your podcast show, there was a podcast at one point on the role of the fleet and the sea and the shipyards, I think. I don't know who, do you remember who that was? It was a brilliant episode.
It will probably have been Kate Jameson.
Yes, it was. Yes, that's the one. So he argued that Napoleon needed shipyards with access for heavy, deep-lying frigates and vessels in order, and he didn't have them in France. So apart from Bordeaux, and but not even in Bretagne, and even if you were creating ships there, it would have been very intricate to get munition, materials, all the things that you need, the men to that far away cities on the coastal line. So he hoped that in Spain, with better infrastructure, with better shipyards, he could perhaps create more ships there. But even that would have cost him so much more time than he already had on his hands. So even that, I think, would not be a convincing argument to start an invasion in Spain at the moment. He could also have asked Spain or go in there and make them build ships, or so that still for me does not explain the fact that he's completely upsetting, upending, throwing the country in chaos and getting even less out of it than he already had. So, and that's not hindsight, that's already there in the moment. And also after the Battle of Trafalgar, he should have learned at that time that there was nothing much left for him to lay his hands on in terms of fleet and vessels.
Um, yes or no. I think there are some parts of this that I would go agree with, and of course knowing historians, we're never satisfied with explanations. We always look for complexity, right? So I think you raise important points, and I would agree with some of them. It's not that. I mean, you alluded to, for example, the Spanish, for example, ports and arsenals that Napoleon certainly wants to take control of. We already discussed the colonial resources that he certainly wants to harness to far greater degree than Spain could. The one thing I don't buy, and that's not the argument you've raised, but I do want to bring in, and that is an argument that Napoleon kind of wanted to bring the liberal reforms and kind of improvements to Spain. I think it's a later day kind of addition to it. Even if we look at the Constitution of 1808, it has some important reforms and changes, such as elimination of internal tariffs, for example. But ultimately, it is an imperial constitution. I don't think Napoleon is necessarily there to, out of the kindness of his heart, to develop Spain. No, knowing the continental system, the way Napoleon envisioned the continental system, Spain was there to satisfy French needs, to be the feeding grounds for the French economy. I think one of the arguments that kind of thinking of it that comes to my mind is there's a wonderful historian of Spain who wrote on Spanish resistance, John Lawrence Tone. And Tone, I think, makes a point that I think we should certainly raise, is that one of the problems of explaining Napoleon's decision is because none of the decisions really, none of the factors that we try to bring are too clearly explaining all of it. And ultimately, Tone actually argues that that most convincing argument, as far as he thinks, is militarism. And he famously says militarism is like an addictive drug, and it is a drug that forces you to keep going. And so what his argument is that by late 1807, early 1808, France's economy is actually struggling. And he has a point there, because we know that France was in the midst of an acute financial crisis in 1805, 1806. The war is still raging in 1807. And even though Napoleon is winning, the benefits of the war are not as clear cut in terms of in economic and financial terms. And so Tone's argument is that as the empire is expanding, the expenditures are rising astronomically, especially military expenditures, and there is this ongoing support for expansionism, and that for him, Napoleon's invasion of Spain is really based on this militarism and the desire for economic, spoliation of foreign resources, sustaining the narrative of imperial glory, and so on and so on. And maybe that is also an important factor to consider, a factor that forces Napoleon to ignore all the facts that you've raised, Beatrice, in your response.
Yeah, and well, I also think, to bring in yet another point where you could say that he was just Napoleon automatically rolling out a blueprint that he also had inflicted on the other countries in Europe, namely going in and then deposing of the legitimate kings and just or princes, and then just putting a sibling on the throne. And I also think that in Spain, that particularly fact backfired tremendously. So compared to the Netherlands, where there was not a monarchy, it was a republic. Yes, the Oranges had been there, but they weren't that well liked anymore. They were already gone for quite a number of years. In 1830, when they came back, what I mean here is that he dethroned both Charles IV, and then the heir to the throne, Ferdinand. And he also did away with Queen Maria Louisa. She was also sent home, what do I know? And then he put his brother on the throne. But that was seen with his reforms and with his constitution, and you say rightly so, that's an imperial constitution, but for the people on the ground, for the native population, for the noblemen, for the clergymen, it was not just imperial, it was considered diabolical. It was considered an intrusion. They were abolishing the feudal privileges, the monastic orders, something that Napoleon also had done in the Rhenish provinces, in the Dutch countries and elsewhere. But there were reform movements had already been present there, and in the Netherlands and the Rhenish provinces, there were patriots who were welcoming the reign of the Bonapartes, but not in Spain. It was the exact opposite. So, right from the beginning, that sparked the mobilization, the rise of anti-French juntas that aligned with every segment of Spanish society, and that started right from the Dos de Mayos, from the beginning on, and especially then when Joseph came with all his reforms. So this is also perhaps that he thought it would go the same way like he did in Poland and in the German lands and the Netherlands. But even after 1 year, he should have found out, or after 1808, when they also aligned with the British forces, we're going to probably be talking about that in a minute, with the troops of Wellington, he should have known that it was a guerrilla warfare, that he would never be able to win. I'm struggling with the fact that you can just discard it as hindsight knowledge, because it was already clear at that very present moment that Spain...
I don't think it was, frankly. I don't think it was.
No?
I mean, again, he certainly would have expected, and he did. And again, correspondence is clear. He expected some resistance. But remember, he faced resistance like this in Italy. And how was it resolved? By burning villages at Pavia, for example. He faced resistance like this in Tyrol. How was it resolved?
Yeah, but
by
it's
mass
uh,
occupation and crackdown.
no, you're right, Alex, and I don't want to come up with some counterfactual reasoning, but if you look at accounts of the guerrilla warfare, so not the conventional battles, but this aspect of warfare that was very horrific and horribly there in Spain, more than in Tyrol and in Italy and elsewhere, because you're right, there were pockets of resistance there, but the area was smaller. The people that stood up to Napoleon, also in the Italian lands, it was less of a mass movement in the population than it was in Spain, where all the factions that had been fighting each other before, bear in mind, there were already heavy factions in Spain of the various princes and the various kings and the various allegiances, but they all came together, forged together in their resistance against Napoleon. And that was bigger, it was more dispersed, the country was less accessible. So the situation on the ground in Spain was different than in northern Italy or in Tyrol, just regarding the numbers and the sheer size of the territory. Perhaps you could only compare it with Russia, but that is a different situation. But I mean, I just think that he, from the beginning on, he underestimated his grip and his control over and the capability that he attested to Joseph of centralizing the country. It just didn't work from the beginning on.
I agree with that he underestimated the scale of the problem, not the
Exactly.
problem itself, right?
No, you're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
the scale, sure. And when we talk about, I think you raised a very important kind of point of the success of Napoleonic reforms and elsewhere, and how much that was dependent on pre-existing conditions, right?
Yes.
Michael Broer's
Michael, exactly. The
right quote.
colonization of Europe.
Exactly. Uh-huh.
That's the
That's right.
seminal book on this.
Mhm. That's right. And I think, but again, that's to me, it is not clear that Napoleon really understood that in, let's say, at the time. What he saw was the success of the French occupational regimes in places like Netherlands, like Rhineland, like northern Italy, where the strength of arm and the control of the cities meant that you can impose a series of reforms that, quote unquote, improve the local life and then benefit the empire. And from Napoleon's point of view in 1808, he doesn't need to occupy all of Spain. He needs to occupy the focal points of it, which he does already in February, March, April of 18, the occupation of fortresses, first stage, occupation of major cities, second stage. So by the summer of 1808, he could be, in many ways confident enough that by controlling the urban spaces and the focal points, he will be able to impose something similar to what he's done elsewhere.
Yeah,
And
but
that's
then,
where I think your argument comes in, is underappreciating the scale of the resistance.
yeah, and also another. This is a very strange situation. I now feel that I'm assaulting. I'm. How do you say the prosecution against Napoleon, and need to make the case. Whereas I think history already made that case. But another very important fact is, I think, that Napoleon hardly was in Spain ever. So he'd spent less, I think, what was it, than 3 months in Spain in late 1808. So he was in Italy. He was the one that won the campaigns in Italy by his own hand. So he was there. He knew the lay of the land. He knew how these cities looked like. He went to my city of Utrecht. He went to The Hague. He went to the Netherlands. He went to Germany. He was massively there. So he knew how he should maneuver, but he didn't know anything about Spain, and he also refused to receive or even read intelligence about the climatic conditions, the mountainous terrain, the dearth of water. So he just the infertile soil, and then let alone that he underestimated the fighting capacities of the British army. Zach, you know more about this, so we want to hear you as well. And my feeling is that the British troops and the Spanish troops, out of their own authentic, what do I know, traditions, they put up such a type of fight and a scale of fight and a scale of a terrain that Napoleon, he just failed to do the reconnaissance properly. And it's not just a political error, it's not an economic error, it's a basic military error, isn't it?
Hello, folks. I am still here. Um, I think we might just have set a record for how long I've managed to go without asking a question on this show. And Luke, I've just been texting the horsemen of the podcalypse, as we call ourselves. Self, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe. Um, to notify them of the fact that I've gone for 30 minutes without saying anything. Luke will particularly be delighted by this. To your query though,
I think you
Beatrice,
should earn some of your wages now, Zach. You should share them with us.
Beatrice continues to roast me in a continuation of a tradition from an In Conversation episode that's actually going to air on New Year's Eve. So after this one goes out, so you can look forward to the first foray that Beatrice takes into absolutely destroying me. Um, but to your point, it pains me to say this because this is the point where I kind of have to choose between two of my favorite historians. Nobody ever likes to be in that scenario. I think when it comes from a to a military standpoint where the British are concerned, um, I would lean more towards what Alex is saying, that there isn't a sense that um, the British involvement is going to be anywhere near as much of a problem for the French as it transpires to be. And if anything, you have a proof of that in what happens when Moore takes over command of the British forces, when Wellesley goes home to defend his reputation in response to the Convention of Sintra, and it's a shambles. And Josh and I will explore precisely why it turns out to be a shambles in the next installment that's coming very early in the new year. But what that inevitably does is it sort of proves the rule that, well, the British, we can just chase them out of the country. They're fine. Yeah, sure, this guy called Wellesley's pitched up in Portugal. He's won a couple of battles and he's crushed Juno, but Juno was having problems. He was isolated. You know, it's very easy to trivialize, from Napoleon's perspective, very easy to trivialize what's going on because the achievements aren't that great. When you think about what Britain's been doing militarily, what are we talking? The Abercrombie expedition? Okay. But is that the world's greatest achievement? Well, it's okay, it's a significant feat for British arms. It's a stepping stone in that journey towards becoming the fighting force that we're accustomed to think that gets commanded by Wellington and gets honed and produces things like Salamanca and Vittoria and all the rest of it. But that's not there at this moment in time. Where I would agree with you, Beatrice, is the lack of geographical awareness. And the reason that I flag that is because sometimes the only way to really get a sense of what you're talking about is to go to these places. And even today, if you take the time to travel around Spain, even in a car, you do get this huge sense of
Exactly.
how vast the distances are and how isolated these population centers in the forms of cities and towns actually are in the grand scheme of things. And so if you're going to use force of arms in order to force your will on a population, well, you can hold the population centers, but there's a lot of countryside in between them. And I think we're all in agreement, Alex, as well, that failure to appreciate the scale of the task is where militarily he fails. But I think in terms of the British aspect, the British have got a way to go before they're sort of the
Yeah.
fighting force that's going to win Salamanca.
Very briefly on that, because you do taunt me a little bit that, but you're right, obviously. But my point is a bit more abstract, perhaps. So I was not referring to big British successes, but because you're right, obviously there weren't big successes of that kind yet. But it's the opposite. If you and I'm coming from this with my other hat on, terrorism, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare. If you look at the big theaters of guerrilla war, it's always, if you fight on the land itself, then the inhabitants, the natives of the country itself, always in the guerrilla war are on the advantage because they know the skill. They know how to retreat. The one day they're a farmer, the next day they're a soldier. It's what happened in Afghanistan to the Russians and to the Americans, to us. It's what happened in other places. It's what happened in India partly. And it's also happening now in Spain. So, as a guerrilla person once said, they have the munition, we have time. So the Spanish guerrilla warfarers, they had the time on their hands, and the Prussians knew this. So right from the beginning in Prussia, after 1806, or not right from the beginning, after this big defeat in 1806, the Prussians realized we have to do something. So Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Clausewitz, they then looked at what was going on from 1808 onwards in the Iberian War, and they studied guerrilla training techniques. They watched carefully what was going on, what the French made for mistakes. There was lots of reports on that already in the newspapers, in the military journals. And Carl von Clausewitz later wrote a whole chapter on what was happening in Spain, and he already collected the materials earlier. He said, arming the nation. Actually, Napoleon was the chap who started this, but the Spanish were even better with that, so they did it without conscription. The guerrillas just went into it, and the scorched earth policy that then was employed against the French army under Massena during the third invasion of Portugal by Wellington, that was something that the Prussians studied, but the Russians probably too. So it wasn't there right from the beginning in 1808, but I think that in a year, throughout the years 1808, 1809, 1810 at the least, Napoleon should have done what the Prussians and the British and the others were doing as well, studying what's going on and just acknowledging that the French were not winning. The British perhaps weren't either, but we now know that they didn't need to. I mean, that's my point with guerrilla warfare. You just don't have to, you should not lose, but you don't have to win straight away. You win in the end.
By 1810, I'd absolutely agree with what you're saying there. I think the problem, and in the world of Napoleonic Wars podcast bingo, here's a box to be ticked off because I'm about to bash Murat. I would suggest that it takes a while to realize the scale of what Murat has ended up doing with the brutality and the viciousness of the reaction to the Dos de Mayo, fundamentally the Tres de Mayo, and how in doing so that takes what should have been a local riot and fans it in a way that is fundamentally unnecessary. It becomes this sort of propaganda boon for certainly the British. Look at the way that Napoleon's treating this population when they're rising up in defense of their own sovereign. But equally, if you want to, and this is where Charles Esdale would, of course, enter the chat and say, well, the nature of resistance to French intervention is very sort of checkered, and this perception that we have of guerrilla warfare really isn't sort of this idea that behind every rock and behind every tree there is sort of a Spanish patriot brandishing a musket. I'm not saying that you're suggesting that either, Beatrice, but that is a perspective that we do need to factor into this conversation, because that it takes time for the realization of what you're really facing to hit home. And this is a problem that Murat, to use a modern analogy, sort of pours petrol on the bonfire, makes it so much worse.
Yes.
But Napoleon, in some respects, does the right thing, right? Alex alluded to it earlier. He comes south in 1808, launches that campaign, but then, as you say, Beatrice, he goes back north 3 months later.
Yeah.
In early 1809,
exactly.
He's done with his Peninsular War. And I think that's where you're absolutely right to suggest that by 1810, he needed to sort of realize that he wasn't getting a grip on this situation. Now, the counter argument, of course, is, well, he gets distracted with the whole building a dynasty thing. And he sends Massena not wanting to come out of retirement, but is forced to, is Massena meant to be Napoleon's proxy? Well, there's a whole convoluted discussion that we can frankly save for another podcast. But because he's more focused on having an heir, he does, and you could say, well, the Austrians contribute to that. It makes him more aware of that need to protect his eastern flank. He doesn't go back to Spain and Portugal to properly finish the job. Alex, can I bring you in?
No, I agree. I agree. Besides, this was the first question.
That isn't the record, though. That is not the record. We have managed to go for a full hour and 10 on one question before, but with many sort of sub questions and diversions and rabbit holes. But yeah, 30 minutes I am just sitting here thinking this is marvelous. Basically got a ringside seat to you two is what this it's a bit like in teaching, like you want to reach that point where your students are bouncing off of each other and you don't need to say anything. This is the academic sort of equivalent, but it's kind of the inverse because the junior person just kind of fires a question at
No,
you
no,
two.
no, you said it. Alex, we are so obliged and honored to be Zach's students, aren't we?
What absolute
He sent us
nonsense.
running around. We're just doing his job for him.
You are doing my job for me because you're entertaining folks. I was going to talk about many things, a number of notes that I've jotted down here, everything from Hispanophobia in some of the historical interpretations. We've talked about whether or not there's a precedent for the resistance already, so we can park that. Questions about freedom of economic policy and reactions to that. In some cases, I wonder if we're sort of are we talking about a just war facet here? Is part of the reason that the Peninsular War particularly excites a lot of debate if you set aside the fact that the British just love to bang on about it because it's the most significant thing that they do and it's the only time they kind of consistently win on land for about 50 years. Um, is part of this sort of the sense that the way in which the Peninsular War plays out kind of offends a sense of inverted commas just war, in that with all of the brutality, with all of the atrocity, with the heavy-handedness, the toppling of monarchs, the way in which Napoleon fundamentally is sort of saying, look, you're all going to adhere to my economic policy, and if you don't like it, then I'm just going to use force to make you do what I want. Does all of that kind of offend people's sense of what is and isn't reasonable grounds for the declaration of war?
No, I don't. You mean for the contemporaries? I don't
Yeah.
think it did. Certainly not on a large scale. There might have been, okay, individuals who were raising issues like this, uh, but 1808 comes in after 16 years of warfare in Europe. Um, I don't think they have. I don't think Spain represents anything unusual in 1808 that the contemporaries have not seen. By 1810, 1811, sure,
Mm.
the scale, the intensity of it that shocks the contemporaries and actually it reinvigorates the resistance. And Beatrice mentioned the Prussians who are kind of learning from the Spanish experience. And I just published an article on reassessing the Russian strategy in 1812. And if you look at the Russian discussions, which are to a great degree informed by the Prussian officers, they all talk about learning from Spanish resistance. So in that sense, Spanish example is absolutely important because it informs um, Prussian, Russian, to a degree Austrian thinking on how you deal with an enemy like Napoleon, who's been quite unstoppable until now, right? But I think my interest in this war, considering that it's not going, it will not be going as well for the French, and with my Francophilia being so pronounced, um, my interest in this war lay more in the realm of maybe politics and socioeconomics rather than military affairs. I certainly admired the British performance during the Peninsular War. But what I find interesting, and maybe this is kind of a way of bridging our earlier discussion, is that one of the ways Napoleon was not prepared to deal with this problem, kind of in one of the ways he underappreciated the scale of the problem he will be confronting, is that his decision to detain these Spanish monarchy was clearly intended to effectively decapitate the Spanish leadership, right? To remove the king, the entire royal family, and render the traditional institutions of central government ineffective. So there will be no resistance because there is no leaders. And I think uh, what what he didn't expect, because he encountered it in Italy, he didn't encounter it in Germany, in Belgium or Netherlands, right? What he didn't encounter is the almost overnight development of a decentralized network of local authorities. And that's very peculiar to the Spanish experience, right? So there are no juntas in Italy. There are no juntas in German countryside or Prussian countryside in the wake of the Prussian king's decision to flee to the east, right? But here in Spain, I think we are dealing with a remarkable political innovation in which a group of people are arguing that they will take the matter in their own hand, and not on the basis of popular sovereignty, like, let's say, Americans have done or the French have done during their revolution, but rather they're doing it within what Beatrice was saying, kind of this conservative mindset of a long-standing contractual concept of monarchy, that the king has the sovereignty, but if the king is not there, the people are reclaiming it for the duration of the king's absence. And that's really an interesting concept, and I don't think Napoleon, certainly we clearly know he didn't expect it, but I don't think he would have expected, or anyone else would have expected. It's something of a new political order in which people are independent sovereign, but they also are not. They expecting the king to come back and reclaim sovereignty. And I think there is a way to think. I don't remember who said it, but they were saying that the juntas acted like a collective prince rather than the revolutionary power. And I like this kind of framework of it, where Napoleon is confronting a new type of decentralized resistance, which is a political resistance. It's hard to deal with 18 juntas, right? I think Supreme Juntas, 18 of them came up in 1808, 1809. And I think that's the nature of the problem that ultimately saps his resources.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And well, he also underestimated, which is again strange, because he himself was so apt at channeling half of even not quite successes into great victories via propaganda. So he used his army bulletins. You wrote about his sack, but he also used paintings, the famous painting of Napoleon in the Pest house in Jaffa. He used that to sort of project his power and his victory. But then he did not expect that other people would use his atrocities against him. So if you take Francisco Goya, you all know this famous Spanish painter who was the court painter in 1808 for decades already. And he then started to paint a series which he called The Disasters of War, where he portrayed skeletal children, the women begging, the executions, the shootings, rape even, and it was sent around. So people knew that what Napoleon was doing. And this also sparked in Spain itself and in Portugal. This sparked exactly what you're talking about, Alex. And then even after that, so I'm now jumping a bit forward in time, that then later on, this was also used by uprisings in South America, against Spain, for example, against Portugal, to use this as a kind of way of rallying popular resistance against illegitimate monarchs, illegitimate regimes. So it's something that, again, he did not expect to happen. And the question is, how bad was Napoleon this? This, I think, is also an important question. You both said that it had been seen before. Killing and looting had been there, and even the British Army also did horrible things in Spain with the sacking of Ciudad Rodrigo. Charles Esdale wrote about it. I think he even says it's one of the darkest chapters in the history of the British Army. Badajoz, San Sebastian, so they did that too. The question still remains, did Napoleon or did his officers intentionally command their men to use murder, rape, and slaughter as a war instrument? Did they use that intentionally? And there's some indications that he did, that the population of Madrid, the population elsewhere in Spain, that they were wiped out intentionally, so that the pillaging, the raping, all those harrowing accounts, that they were not just happenstances and occurrences, collateral damage, that it was a strategy to exhaust and perhaps even to wipe out the Spanish population, to just bring them into the mold.
Spanish and Portuguese, it's worth saying. What I think sometimes gets missed is that we look at the horrors of the third French invasion of Portugal, that's the Massena one, and we talk about Wellington and the scorched earth policy, and there's an interesting ethical debate to be had there about the impact that that has, and the fact that fundamentally your ally is inflicting this on your population. But what we are also aware of is not only that the when the French are sat before the lines of Torres Vedras and then subsequently pull back slightly further north, and they do go out and commit horrendous atrocities, they also commit acts of essentially cultural vandalism. And that cultural vandalism is things like tearing down churches, etc., which is directly organized by Massena's headquarters.
Yes.
So what you have here is a situation where the people at the top are organizing the destruction of the culture of the very people they are trying to conquer.
Today we would call that at least indications of genocide.
Precisely.
And I have one quote, if I may, Zach, that totally speaks to what you're saying now. I found it in the memoirs of Maurice de Tascher, and he writes about the sacking of Cordoba, the 13th of June 1808, and he says, the cathedral and the sacred lives within were not spared, which made the Spanish look upon us in horror, saying out loud that they would prefer we violated their women rather than their churches. We did both. The convent had to suffer all that debauchery has invented and the outrages of the soldier given up to himself. It's horrible. So sorry to bring this in, but I think it underscores your point, and it's so important that this is something. I do think that was gradually, but it was a novel dimension of this war.
I mean, you absolutely don't need to apologize for bringing it in, Beatrice, because this is precisely the point that we this is why we do these shows, and we've never shied away from the horrible elements before, and we're not going to start doing so now. People need to appreciate the scale of the horrors of war. You're absolutely right to flag that the British are not angels by any stretch of the imagination. I've talked about that at length. Don't worry, folks. I'm not about to reprise my sort of crime and punishment soapbox here, but we can't pretend that the British are all conquering angels. Um, there is there is a huge amount of violence by both sides on innocent civilians as part of the course of this war, and done in a very callous way. I want to talk about reactions beyond Europe to this sort of first phase of the war. Some folks might sort of regard the Peninsular War as a backwater. If we've got time, we might explore that ever so slightly. But I think it's a mistake to think that the Peninsular War only has implications within the European landmass or within the Iberian Peninsula for a couple of very obvious reasons that we've alluded to already. Napoleon is thinking about things in a sort of pan-European and much sort of wider perspective. There have been suggestions that, and I think this is something that Charles explores in his book on the Peninsular War, to what extent was Spain perhaps a stepping stone for North Africa? But also, we're talking about European empires in Spain and Portugal. Think about where the Portuguese monarchy flee to. They flee to Brazil. So this has a knock-on effect. We also have talked on this show, but more generally within the historiography, about the way in which Napoleon's actions in Spain and Portugal fundamentally weaken the empires of both Spain and Portugal by demonstrating just how easy it is for other nations in Europe to humiliate these nations. So there is a global fallout just from the Peninsular War, never mind the Napoleonic Wars. Alex, I'm going to come to you first on this. What's your sense of the global implications, the global fallout, and also the global reactions?
You mean in hindsight or contemporaneously?
Both actually.
I think, of course, in hindsight, we know this is. I certainly made the argument in my writing that the impact of Napoleonic wars on Spanish colonial empire is one of the most important consequences of the war, certainly the most enduring one. I don't think the Spanish Empire would have endured much longer, let's say, be without Napoleonic Wars, and there would have been a process of gradual change and to a degree emancipation, maybe. But it is Napoleonic Wars that serve as a catalyst for the collapse of the empire. So, if nothing else, the emergence of a new Western Hemisphere by 1825, right? It's a long process. Certainly, we have to bear in mind. It begins in 1808, with the Napoleon's, sparked by Napoleon's invasion of Spain, but it will not be over until the mid 1820s. So it's a long process. But ultimately, the end result of it is the creation of a very different Western Hemisphere, with the different aspirations, different political setup. All of that is direct outcome of the things that we discuss. I think the question, maybe the bigger question to ponder whether this was a revolution, in the sense that historians like to articulate, kind of employ concepts and kind of nice frameworks of argument. And one of it is the argument for Atlantic revolutions, right? So we have American Revolution, we have French Revolution, which spreads into the Caribbean, and now ostensibly do we have a revolution in Latin America. And that is something, an interesting kind of line of reasoning, because unlike, let's say, French Revolution, the transformations that are taking place in Latin America after 1808 are more of a political revolution without a necessary socioeconomic revolution. So that in itself should force us to maybe contemplate what do we consider revolution? Let's say Rio de la Plata becoming independent but retaining its socioeconomic structures and inequality, is that a revolution? And to a degree that applies to American colony, the former American colonies, the United States, which has a revolution, but without the genuine social transformation that we sometimes think revolutions bring. But there is no denying the Napoleon's decision to invade Spain is not just a European matter. It's a matter of really global ramifications. And I think, if you indulge me, one of the interesting kind of side stories to it is that when Napoleon, invaded Spain and Portugal, of course, one of the things that these invasions made possible are the possibility of collaboration. So, for example, having done kind of research on the Russian side, I know that almost as soon as the news of the Portuguese royal family going to Rio de Janeiro and the Spanish royal family being detained, the Russian government was actually very excited about the prospect of penetrating the Portuguese and Spanish colonial empires, because previously this would have been impossible, right? Neither royal authorities would have allowed trade on a degree that would be possible now. In fact, from 1808 to 1811, we have a series of proposals by the Russian government, to the Russian government, or it's a kind of collaborative proposals between Russian government and the Russian mercantile interests about all-out expeditions to South America in order to establish this commercial presence that would allow Russians to tap the unexplored riches of the natural resources of Brazil and Spanish Spanish colonies. And that to me is interesting because, again, knowing what the Portugal and Spain were going through, from Russian emperor's perspective, this was an opportunity, right, rather than something to be frowned upon.
And the British are doing exactly the same thing, right? They look at this and just start rubbing their hands together because they wanted access to the Spanish and Portuguese imperial markets. It's so much so that, where is Wellesley destined for before he's diverted to Spain and Portugal? He's off to Mexico to go and
Also,
start
yeah.
conquering chunks and open up those markets. So it's a sort of there's a sense of opportunism in how nations are approaching this.
I think you certainly will remember the one of the first concessions that British extracted from, for example, region Portuguese region João after transporting him to Rio de Janeiro was opening up Brazilian market to the British commerce. Of course, the British attempts to penetrate the Portuguese and Spanish colonial markets go back to 17th century. I mean, the poor Captain Jenkins's ear was the the victim of one of that attempts. And of course, more recently, and I hope Jacqueline Reiter is listening to us. Of course, the expeditions of Popham to Buenos Aires, opportunistic. Whether they were sanctioned by the British government or not, they were clearly opportunistic enterprises to derive benefit from a situation. And that's 2 years before Napoleon even goes into Spain. So, no, in short, discussions like this, I think, point to the complexity. Again, the interconnection and complexity of historical events. Here we see Napoleon making decisions for I think after 2 hours of discussion for some unclear reason, right? About to go into Spain, but the reverberations of it are such that are felt in places like Santiago, Chile, or Caracas, Venezuela, and then Buenos Aires in Argentina, not to mention that it sparks a really powerful, I think one of the most interesting aspects of this story is a powerful kind of popular movement in Mexico, in New Spain, with a far more radical agenda than that was embraced not just by the lower classes, but by the priests. In fact, if anything, the role of the church, which in Europe is oftentimes perceived to be as a counter-revolutionary and opposing kind of the changes brought about by revolution, well, the movement that emerges in Mexico is the movement in which priests are leading the way towards the greater socioeconomic equality. Ultimately, they don't succeed, but the attempt is certainly there.
Beatrice?
Yes, I so like this, Alex. I think we're so good. After 2 hours of discussion, our conclusion is he did it for unclear reasons. I totally like it.
Can
Well,
I just say that is so typical of the Napoleonic Wars podcast? Napoleon did some things for reasons.
yeah, exactly. However, I can be more specific on the major consequences that he sparked, and there's two that I would finally flag at the end of this podcast. The first one is, I would say, a good consequence, or at least a fascinating, hopeful, forward-looking consequence, which he probably didn't envisage at all, is the constitutional revolution. So you mentioned already, Alex, the revolutions in France, the Atlantic revolutions in Latin America, but even let alone the revolutions. What happened was that through Napoleon, and it takes too long to argue and to explain that now, but at least the idea of constitutions, of popular rule, perhaps not democratic rule yet, but popular rule came into existence as being laid down in a social contract with a real paperwork and paragraphs on it. And that was one of the first major important constitutions in Europe, was the Constitution of Cadiz. And that one in 1812 became the blueprint for many other constitutions that were then developed in the Southern European world, in Greece, for example, in Naples, in other Italian states, and also in the South of America, and then again in Spain later on during the Liberal Triennium. So a lot happened due to the fact that officers, many military officers were taking part, also the clerics, but also military officers were taking part in drafting these constitutions. Linda Colley wrote about the pen and the sword, and how the spread of the Napoleonic Wars also correlated with, or perhaps even causated, the spread of constitutional rule. not in the sense that it all became overnight democratic, not at all, sometimes even the other way around, but the idea of constitution was then never away anymore. That's the one very important consequence, I would say, specifically also in the field of the Iberian War. There's a very big book written about it and came out a couple of months ago by Maurizio Isabella, Southern Europe, and he says there's a very specific story to tell about revolutions, the age of revolutions in Southern Europe, and it starts with the revolution in Cadiz, which is very interesting. The other major influence, I already hinted at that at the beginning, is that when Napoleon was defeated, Spain and Portugal did not return as world empires. So on the global stage, they disappeared. And I think it was in 1810 and then 1815 again, Castlereagh, so the British foreign minister, and Tsar Alexander, they issued a kind of a proclamation in which they said, well, we now have this new structuring of the world, which meant the European world. America wasn't even calculated in, and we have now four first-rank powers. I already mentioned them: Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain. The second-rank powers, they can even be our satellites: so Spain, Portugal, Sweden, the Netherlands, Baden-Württemberg, and there's third-rank powers that may even be pleased and thankful that they exist still. So it's a very hierarchical, very imperial reading of the world, but that map was then indeed imposed on the international state system. And at the Congress of Vienna, when that was convened, the four big powers convened it. France was invited in, so France would, after 1818, counted as the fifth big power. And Labrador, he was the Portuguese envoy, he protested. He said, where are Spain, where are Portugal? We're there as well. But they were not factored in anymore. They were not invited to become, when then I wrote about the book about this, the Allied Council, and that convened in Paris to divide the spoils of the war, to run the occupation, to set up the Holy Alliance. Spain and Portugal were sitting in the back bench. They were not on the front bench anymore. And that really upended and changed the world of international relations from that moment on. To a certain extent, those big powers are still the powers of today. So they're still the powers with the veto right on the United Nations Security Council, for example. So I think that's one of the major important consequences that we tend to overlook, that Napoleon inadvertently, unwittingly produced.
And somehow, Beatrice has managed to bring us back full circle to where we started this by bringing balance of power back into the heart of the conversation. Because I promised listeners that we would cover this topic in the opening, I'm just going to ask you for a single sentence response to this question in order to set us up for a follow-up episode. Of course, assuming that you guys aren't going to run away screaming at the prospect of being back on this show anytime soon. The Peninsular War was an irrelevant sideshow. What's your reaction to that claim? And you can focus on this militarily, you can focus on it from a geopolitical, from a legacy standpoint, whichever one you want to take. But what's your view on that? Beatrice, do you want to start us off?
Well, I'm going to give you back your own words. I think it was one of Napoleon's biggest mistakes.
And Alex?
When? So my question will be when? 1808, 1809, yes, it is a sideshow. And the fact that Napoleon is not present is a clear indication of it. Or the fact that you're sending second-rate generals, I'm sorry, is an indication of it. Or the fact that Britain only really commits to it by 1810, right? By late 1809, 1810 is an indication to it. So the question will be, is a timing. In 1807, 1808, and I would say halfway through 1809, Peninsular affairs are important, but they're not as important as the big decisions that are being made among the great powers on the future of the continent. It is only after 1809 that Peninsular War becomes really a very important element in the bigger struggle. I already mentioned that it is the conflict that informs other resistance movements. It is absolutely clear that Prussians and Russians studied Wellington's campaigns. In fact, Scharnhorst in 1812 is riding straight. to Emperor Alexander and tells him that the type of war you should wage against Napoleon in 1812 is a type, this is the quote, is a type of war that Wellington is wages in
Exactly.
Spain. Methodical, uh, avoidance of decisive battle until all the advantages are on your side, right? Exchange space for time and attrition. And so I think there is no denying that by 1812, it is a crucial it's a crucial battlefield. But having said that, Zach, I think speaking of Napoleon's mistakes, right, Beatrice, that even then it boggles my mind that in 1812 Napoleon decides to go to Russia when he has all these resources to put order, everything in order in Spain, chase those pesky British into the sea, and then deal with the rest of the continental affair. So I think when we talk about the mistakes, I think in hindsight we can identify 1808 as a mistake, but I would even say that 1812 is the biggest mistake that he makes. It's a mistake that overshadows the decisions of 1808, because I am firm believer that Napoleon in 1812 could have solved the Peninsula problem. If he had taken half of the resources he had at his disposal,
Yes.
gone to Portugal or Spain, the British would not have been able to resist him, and neither would have the Spanish. It is a different question of whether Napoleon would have been able to build a viable French state or Napoleonic state, let me put this, Napoleonic state in Spain. But he would have certainly be able to turn the situation around. And his decision not to is inexplicable to me.
I would strongly agree with what you said there, Alex. Fundamentally, it is Napoleon's decision to commit to an invasion of Russia that leads to the end of the stalemate in the Peninsular War that has basically descended over the course of 1811. I look forward to us continuing that conversation in due course. But until then, Alex Mikaberidze, Professor of History at Louisiana State University, Shreveport, and Professor Beatrice de Graaf from the University of Utrecht. Thank you both so much for your time. Have a very Merry Christmas. And I look forward to us continuing our conversations in the new year.
Me too. Zach, thank you.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.